The galaxy had a name for itself. It called itself the Eternal Accord, a collection of 47 civilizations that had been ruling the stars for longer than most planets had solid ground. They had laws older than human writing. They had weapons that could crack moons. They had stations the size of continents, floating between stars like jewelry worn by something ancient and proud. And at the center of all of it sat the Galactic High Council, 11 species who together decided everything. Who traded with whom? Who was allowed to expand? Who got resources and who got nothing? Who lived in comfort and who lived under a boot? They were not evil, exactly. That was the strange part. Most of them believed completely that they were doing what was right. They had built peace, after all. The Eternal Accord had not seen a full-scale war in over 3,000 years. They were proud of this. They talked about it constantly. In their grand halls, with ceilings high enough to fit clouds, they gave speeches about stability and order and the careful management of lesser species. They used the word management a lot. They never seemed to notice how much that word said about how they saw everyone else. Humanity had been discovered 61 years ago. A Valhari scout ship had detected radio signals coming from a small blue world in an unremarkable solar system near the galaxy's inner arm. The Valhari were one of the Council's founding members, tall, gray-skinned beings with 4 arms and a deep belief in their own wisdom. They had found humanity the way someone finds an ant colony while walking through a garden, with mild curiosity, with the assumption that they were about to do something helpful. First contact had not gone poorly, exactly. Humans had been frightened, then excited, then cautiously diplomatic. They had asked good questions. They had learned fast. The council representatives had found them amusing. Clever little creatures with short lifespans and loud opinions. They communicated in hundreds of different languages and argued with each other constantly, and yet somehow they kept showing up to the negotiating table with a united front. That had surprised the council more than anything. Unity was usually something that took civilizations thousands of years to develop. Humanity had arrived already carrying it, bruised and imperfect but real. They were granted observer status. This was considered generous. Observer status meant humanity could attend council sessions. They could speak when spoken to. They could trade with Accord members under supervised agreements. They could not vote. They could not sit at the main table. They could not own territory beyond their own solar system. And even that was technically under council jurisdiction until humanity completed something called the Developmental Review, a process that, as humans quickly discovered, had no fixed timeline and was entirely controlled by council members who had very little interest in rushing it. For 20 years, humanity played along. They learned the rules. They learned the language, not just Valhari Standard, the official tongue of the Accord, but the real language, the unspoken codes of who deferred to whom, which council members held grudges against which others, which regulations were enforced and which existed only on paper. Human diplomats became very good at reading rooms. Human engineers became very good at studying Accord technology, not stealing it, never stealing it, but watching and understanding and slowly building their own versions from scratch. Human scientists mapped Accord space quietly through legal observation and filed everything away. The council noticed none of this because they were not paying attention. Why would they? Humanity was small. Humanity was young. Humanity had one solar system and a population that, while large by younger species standards, was nothing compared to the Valhari's 12 settled worlds or the Keth Dominion's 38. The council had bigger concerns. There were resource disputes in the outer rings. There was a political fracture developing between 2 of the older member species. There were always problems worth more of their attention than a single system observer species. That sent polite messages and asked good questions at sessions. What the council did not track was the rate at which humanity was building. It was not visible from the outside because humans had made a deliberate choice early on. After studying the Accord's history, which was extensive and available in their archives, because the council was proud of its records, human strategists had identified something important. Every species that had tried to challenge the council directly had been crushed. Not always with violence, sometimes just with economics. The Accord controlled trade routes, resource distribution, and technology licensing. If they decided a species was a problem, that species stopped receiving critical minerals. Their ships got flagged for safety inspections at every port. Their requests went to the bottom of every queue. They got isolated and starved slowly until they came back to the table, ready to accept whatever terms the council offered. Humanity had watched this happen to the Draven Collective 40 years ago. The Draven were a proud species, bioluminescent, highly intelligent, with a gift for mathematics that even the council respected. They had pushed for full membership and voting rights after only 30 years of observer status. The council had smiled and said the time was not right. The Draven had pushed harder. The council had quietly rerouted the trade lane that supplied their colony worlds. Within 8 years, the Draven were signing agreements that effectively gave the council veto power over their internal governance. They had never recovered their independence. Humanity remembered the Draven. Every human diplomat who sat in the Accord's grand halls and smiled at the right moments and asked polite questions remembered the Draven. They carried that memory like a lesson held very close. So humanity did not push. Not visibly. Instead, they built. Underground, literally and figuratively. On Earth and Mars and the Belt colonies and the outer stations, they developed. They poured resources into propulsion research, into material science, into energy systems. They developed relationships with smaller species, the ones who also sat at the edges of the Accord and watched the powerful do whatever they wanted. Species like the Thune, a quiet insectoid civilization with extraordinary agricultural technology. Like the Marin clans, who were considered too nomadic and too few to matter by council standards, but who knew every back-channel trade route in the sector. Like the Pelhari remnant, a fractured people displaced by an old council decision, who had been waiting 40 years for someone to see them as worth talking to. Humanity talked to all of them, quietly, through the polite, legal framework of observer status cultural exchange programs. They built friendships that did not look like alliances because they were careful about what they called things. The 61st year of human contact with the Accord was when the council first noticed something was different. It was small at first. A routine resource allocation request from Earth came through, and when the standard processing delays began, the quiet administrative tool the council used to remind observer species of their place, the human representative in the hall simply nodded and said that was fine. They had made other arrangements. The council member handling the request had paused and asked what arrangements. The human had smiled politely and said that the Thune had excess capacity and were happy to help, and that the Marin clans had recently mapped 3 new efficient routes through the sector, which brought the shipping costs down considerably anyway. The council member had said nothing. But that night, queries went out across the Accord network. They pulled up humanity's development reports, which were technically required to be filed every 2 years as part of observer status. They were always filed on time. They were always polite. They were always slightly vague in ways that had never seemed worth questioning before. Someone finally questioned them, and what came back from the analysts made the chamber go quiet in a way that had not happened in a long time. Humanity had been building for 60 years, and what they had built was not what anyone had expected. The analyst report sat in front of the council for 3 days before a full session was called. The delay itself was unusual. The council typically moved slowly by design, using bureaucratic pace as a kind of power. But this time the slowness came from something else. It came from the fact that several members had read the report privately, and none of them had wanted to be the first one to bring it into the open chamber. That kind of hesitation was rare. It meant the report said something that made confident beings feel uncertain. What it said, in the careful and measured language of accord analysis, was that humanity had quietly become the fourth largest independent manufacturing power in the known galaxy, not the fourth largest among observer species. Fourth overall, behind only the Velurari, the Keth Dominion, and the ancient automated systems of the Myriad, a post-biological civilization so old and strange that they barely interacted with anyone and were mostly counted as a geographic feature of the galaxy rather than a political entity. Humanity, in 61 years, had built themselves to a level that most species required 500 years to reach, and they had done it without triggering any of the standard indicators that the Council's monitoring systems were designed to detect. The reason they had missed it was simple, and it was embarrassing. The Council's monitoring systems were designed to track things like warship construction, weapons testing, territorial expansion, and alliance formation. These were the signals of a species preparing to cause trouble. Humanity had done none of those things, at least not in any form the systems were calibrated to recognize. They had built factories that were registered as research installations. They had developed drives that were filed under experimental civilian propulsion. They had constructed what were logged as deep space observation platforms, but which were, in fact, extraordinarily well-positioned strategic outposts at every major approach corridor to human space, and they had done it all legally. Every installation, every ship, every agreement had been filed correctly under observer status provisions. The provisions were broad because the Council had written them broadly. They had never imagined an observer species would use the room those provisions provided to do anything serious. Observer species were supposed to observe. They were supposed to be grateful. They were supposed to wait. Councillor Vroth of the Velhari called the emergency session to order with less ceremony than usual. She was old even by Velhari standards, with skin the color of cold ashen eyes that had watched 3,000 years of history pass without much surprising her. She was surprised now, and she did not enjoy the feeling. The human representative to the Accord was a woman named Ambassador C.O. Ji-young. She was 53 years old, which in council terms made her barely older than a child. She had held the position for 9 years and had become known in the halls of the Accord as someone who listened more than she spoke, which the council had always taken as a sign of appropriate deference. They understood now that they had mistaken patience for passivity. She was invited into the chamber, an unusual move, as observer species were not typically present for council deliberations. But Vroth had decided that directness was better than theater. She had read the report. She knew what the numbers meant. She wanted to see how the human responded to being seen. Ambassador SEO walked into the chamber the same way she always did, calm, unhurried, dressed in the formal diplomatic attire that humans wore for council sessions, a deep blue that their culture associated with communication and trust. She bowed to the chamber at the appropriate depth, which she always got exactly right, and she sat down at the observer's position, which was lower than the council seats by design. Vroth did not begin with pleasantries. She placed the report summary in front of the ambassador and said simply that the council had some questions about humanity's recent activities. Ambassador C.O. looked at the summary. She nodded slowly. Then she said that she would be happy to answer any questions, and that she hoped the council would also be willing to listen to some things humanity had been wanting to say for a while. The chamber was very quiet. Vrath asked her to begin wherever she liked. What Seo Jiang said over the next hour was not a threat. She was very careful about that. She explained, in plain and simple language, that humanity had been watching the Accord for 60 years and had noticed some patterns. The developmental review, which determined when observer species could apply for full membership, had not been completed for any species in the last 400 years. The last species to achieve full membership had been the Kef, and they had done it through a series of economic concessions that had essentially made them dependent on Velhari trade infrastructure permanently. Before that, the remnants of Shar had applied 17 times over 2 centuries before giving up entirely. She said that humanity had studied these cases, all of them, and they had concluded, respectfully, that the developmental review was not a process. It was a door that was never meant to open. Counselor Vrath said that was a serious accusation. Co said it was an observation. She was an observer species. That was what they did. Someone at the council table made a sound that might have been almost a laugh out. She then explained what humanity had been doing for 60 years. Not in vague terms, in specific ones. She told them about the manufacturing capacity, about the drive technology, which had diverged from Accord standard in some interesting directions that solved certain efficiency problems that the Council's own engineers had considered essentially unsolvable. She told them about the outposts. She told them about the relationships with the Thun, the Marin clans, the Pelhari remnant, and 11 other small species that no Council member had thought to pay attention to, because small species in clusters were not individually significant. Individually, they were not. Together, they represented 42 inhabited worlds across 6 sectors, connected by trade agreements that had been legally filed as cultural exchange programs, sharing resources through networks that had been built, piece by piece, to operate entirely outside of Council-controlled infrastructure. Co let that sit in the room for a moment. Then she said that humanity was not declaring independence from the Accord. They were not making demands. They were requesting, formally and with full documentation, that would be submitted to the public record within the hour, that the Council open the developmental review process for humanity and for 7 other species that humanity was formally co-sponsoring. She listed them by name. The Council had expected a confrontation. What they were getting felt more like a door being opened from the other side. Vrath asked what happened if the Council declined. Co said she hoped they would not decline. But she noted that the infrastructure humanity and its partners had built was fully functional, that it operated legally under existing provisions, and that it would continue to operate regardless of the Council's decision. She said it very quietly. She said it without blinking. Vrath looked at the other Council members. She saw in their faces what she felt herself, the strange and deeply uncomfortable sensation of realizing that the balance of a room had shifted, and that they had not felt it happening. She asked for a recess, outside the chamber, in the long corridor with the high windows that looked out over the station's central hub. One of the junior council aides, a young Kef male who had only been assigned to the chamber for 6 months, stopped the human ambassador to ask her a question. He asked it quietly, away from his superiors. He asked how humanity had managed to do all of it without anyone noticing. Seo Jiang smiled at him. It was a real smile, not a diplomatic one. She told him that the Council had always been watching for a species that would challenge them loudly. Humanity had learned, from watching the Draven and a dozen others, that loud was not the only way to move. She said that her people had a phrase for it, not from their diplomatic vocabulary, but from somewhere older, from the part of human history that remembered being small and surviving anyway. She told him the phrase was simple: play the long game. Then she walked back to the observer's waiting room to let the council deliberate. In the chamber, behind closed doors, 11 of the most powerful beings in the galaxy sat with a report they had not expected and a request they had not prepared for, and tried to decide what to do about a species that had spent 60 years making sure that, by the time this moment came, the answer the council gave would matter very little either way. The recess lasted 6 days. That was, by council standards, extraordinarily short. Major deliberations typically ran for months. Full membership reviews, the theoretical ones, the ones that had not actually happened in 4 centuries, were supposed to take years. 6 days meant the council was either moving with unusual urgency or they were rattled. In the halls and corridors outside the chamber, among the support staff and junior delegates and species representatives who filled the Accord's great station with the ordinary noise of galactic politics, the whisper was that it was both. Ambassador SEO spent the 6 days in the human diplomatic quarters, a modest suite by Accord standards. Because observer species were assigned modest quarters by design, she held meetings. Most of them were not with other human staff. They were with representatives of the Thun, the Marin clans, the Pelhari remnant, and the other species whose names she had put on the formal co-sponsorship list. These were not secret meetings. She had never held secret meetings. Everything was documented, filed correctly, accessible in the Accord's records if anyone cared to look. But nobody had looked for a long time. And now the council was too busy looking at the larger picture to pay attention to the details of who was visiting. The human quarters every morning with Thun tea and data tablets. The Thun representative was a being called a Shvel, which translated roughly as third voice of the deep burrow, a ceremonial title that carried more weight in Thun society than any political rank. Ashvel was elderly, with the characteristic amber and black patterning of a Thun in their final life stage, and they communicated through a combination of acoustic vibration and translated text on a small device they carried. They had been the one who first responded to humanity's quiet outreach 12 years ago. They had taken the longest to trust, and they had become, in ways that formal diplomatic language could not quite describe, something like a close friend to Co Jiyoung. Ashvel wanted to know if the council would agree, not because the agreement was necessary for what they had already built. SEO had been honest with all of her partners about the fact that the infrastructure existed and functioned regardless of what the council decided. But the Thun had been waiting for recognition for a long time, and being recognized by the Accord, even a diminished Accord, still meant something to them culturally. SEO told Ashvel that she genuinely did not know. Then she said that she thought the outcome of the next 6 days would depend less on the council's feelings about humanity and more on something else, on whether the individuals in that chamber still believed, deep down, that power was something you could only hold by keeping others away from it. Ashvel clicked softly, which was how the Thun expressed that they had understood something that required no further words. Inside the chamber, the debate was not going smoothly. The council was not unified on how to respond. They rarely were on anything, which was part of why they moved slowly. Slow movement meant the cracks in their unity stayed hidden. But the pressure of 6 days had forced things into the open that usually stayed politely buried. Counselor Vroth and the Valari delegation were in favor of engaging with humanity's request. Vroth had read everything available about humanity's trajectory, and she had reached the conclusion that the correct response to someone who had built their own table was to invite them to the existing one before the existing one became irrelevant. She was practical above all things. She had watched the Accord survive for 3,000 years by absorbing change when it could not stop it. The Keth Dominion's representative, a heavy-set being called Gareth, was furious. The Keth had built their entire position in the Accord on being the dominant economic partner for the inner systems. What humanity had constructed, the alternate trade routes, the independent supply chains, the network of small allied species, ran directly through territory and trade corridors that Keth influence had controlled for 2 centuries. Gareth did not say that humanity had hurt the Keth financially. He said that humanity had violated the spirit of the observer status agreements, which was a much more diplomatic way of saying the same thing. He wanted the entire human outpost network reviewed, under accord law and several of the cultural exchange. Agreements were classified as unauthorized military alliances. Other 9 council members sat between these 2 positions in various configurations of worry, self-interest, and genuine principle. 3 of them, the Selene, the Eurythben, and the ancient representative of the Myriad, who had not spoken in a council session for 60 years, but showed up now and sat silently at the end of the table, seemed to be watching everything with a careful attention of beings trying to understand what kind of moment this was. On the 4th day, something happened that nobody had scheduled. A communication arrived from outside the station. Not a standard diplomatic channel. Not an Accord network transmission. A direct, broad-spectrum signal that arrived simultaneously at every terminal on the station. Flagged as a public record transmission, which meant it could not be suppressed or delayed, because Accord law protected public record transmissions. As part of the transparency provisions that the Council had written into its founding charter and never expected anyone to actually use against them, the transmission was from humanity's central communications hub on Earth. It contained the full documentation of every agreement, every installation, every trade arrangement, every development milestone that humanity had achieved over the past 60 years. Not summaries, not selected highlights. Everything, hundreds of thousands of documents, cross-referenced and organized with the characteristic human obsession with clear filing systems. The transmission also contained the development records of the 7 co-sponsored species, and it contained a message addressed to every species in the Accord, not just council members, but all 47 member civilizations, including the ones that sat in the same observer galleries where humanity had sat for 6 decades. The message was not long. It said that humanity and its partners were sharing this information with the full Accord because they believed in the transparency that the Accord's own founding documents described. It said they hoped the Council would proceed fairly, and that all member species were welcome to contact them directly through any of the listed channels. It listed the channels. It was very polite. It was also clearly and unmistakably a move that placed the entire situation into the public eye of every civilization in the known galaxy. Counselor Gareth's response to the transmission, delivered privately to Vrav, was several words in Keth that did not translate well, but carried the general meaning of disbelief and grudging, admiration in roughly equal amounts. Vrav found herself, despite everything, almost smiling. She called the council back into formal session on the 5th day. The chamber was fuller than usual. Several member species ambassadors had requested observer seating, citing public interest, and the Accord's rules on session access were clear. They were admitted. The gallery was nearly full. Species that had never bothered attending a council session in living memory were present. Their representatives packed into the tiered seating with the attentive quiet of people watching something they understood was important. Co Jiang was brought in. She sat in the observer position. She folded her hands on the table in front of her and waited. Vrav addressed her. She said the council had reviewed the documentation. She said the legal team had spent 4 days examining every agreement, every installation filing, every trade arrangement. She said, and she paused here in a way that her own staff would later describe as the longest pause they had ever seen her take, that everything was in order. Everything was legal. Every document had been filed correctly. Every provision had been used exactly as written. She said she found this personally. Remarkable.co thanked her. Vroth said that the Keth Dominion had raised concerns about the trade arrangements, and that those concerns would be formally logged. She said the council was not prepared to dismiss them without review. She said this carefully, in the way of someone keeping a promise to a difficult colleague.co. Said that was understood, and that humanity welcomed formal review. Then Vroth said that the council would open a developmental review process for humanity, effective immediately. She said the timeline would be fixed, not open-ended, and that the specific milestones would be mutually agreed upon and placed in the public record within 30 days. She looked at SEO when she said the part about the public record. SEO looked back at her. Then she said the same process would be extended to 4 of the 7 co-sponsored species, with the other 3 to follow upon completion of documentation review. She listed which 4 by name. 2 of them were the Thune and the Pelhari remnant. In the observer gallery, a Pelhari delegate, a thin, silver-haired being who had been in that gallery for 11 years and had watched 11 years of sessions where nothing changed, made a sound that was soft enough that most people did not hear it. But Co Jiang was sitting close enough to the gallery's edge, and she heard it. It was not a word. It was just a sound. The kind of sound a person makes when they have been waiting for something for a very long time, and it finally, actually, begins to happen. That was the moment. SEO would say later, when she allowed. The developmental review that the Council opened for humanity was, by every historical measure, unlike any that had come before it. Past reviews had been vague, open-ended affairs with shifting goalposts and no external accountability. This one was different because it had been negotiated openly. In sessions that were attended by representatives of 31 of the Accord's 47 member species, with milestones documented in the public record where they could not be quietly changed. Humanity had requested that specific provision. The Council had agreed. Neither side said aloud what both understood, that the public transmission humanity had sent on the 4th day of the recess had permanently changed the audience for everything. That happened next. The review took 14 months. That was not fast by any standard, but it was faster than 4 centuries of nothing, which was the alternative benchmark available. During those 14 months, a great deal happened that was not directly related to the review, but was very much related to everything surrounding it. The Keth Dominion submitted their formal complaint about humanity's trade arrangements. The complaint was reviewed by a 3-species panel that the Council assembled, a Velhari, a Solene, and a representative of the Urith Ben, who were known for being boringly meticulous about legal detail. The panel spent 2 months reviewing documentation. Their finding, delivered to the full Council in plain language, was that every human trade arrangement was valid under existing Accord provisions, and that, if the Keth Dominion had concerns about competition in the inner systems, those concerns were economic in nature rather than legal. The panel noted, in a footnote that people discussed for years afterward, that the Accord's founding charter included explicit language about the rights of member and observer species to develop independent economic capacity, language that had apparently not been read carefully by anyone in some time. Gareth's response to the panel's finding was not public, but the Keth Dominion's behavior changed noticeably in the months that followed. They sent a delegation to the Marin clans, the first direct Keth diplomatic contact with the Marin in over 80 years. They also quietly opened trade discussions with 2 of the species on humanity's co-sponsorship list. Whether this represented genuine recalibration or just the practical recognition that the map of influence had shifted, nobody said. Both could be true at the same time. They usually were. What changed most visibly in those 14 Months was the gallery. The observer galleries in the Accord's main chamber had always been present in the architecture. They had been written into the station's design as a gesture toward transparency, a place for non-council species to witness the proceedings. But for most of the Accord's recent history, they had been largely empty. Observer species sent representatives when there was something specific to their situation being discussed, and otherwise did not bother attending sessions that did not concern them, because sessions that did not concern them had a way of staying that way. After the transmission, attendance changed. Not immediately, not all at once, but steadily, session by session, the galleries filled. Species that had been in the Accord for centuries, sitting in their allocated status without much expectation, started paying attention differently. They had watched humanity's documentation arrive on their terminals. They had read the list of co-sponsored species. They had seen the panel's finding. And they were thinking, quietly and carefully, about what it might mean that someone had sat in an observer gallery for 60 years, done everything correctly, and walked out having changed the conditions of the room. Ambassador Seo Jiang appeared before the review panel 7 times over the 14 months. Each session required detailed presentation of human capabilities, intentions, governance structures, and long-term plans. Human officials at every level participated. Scientists, engineers, elected representatives, military officers, economists, cultural historians. The panel asked questions that ranged from technical to philosophical. One session was entirely about how humanity handled internal disagreements, because one of the panel members, the Earth-band representative, a patient and precise being named Vel Kerath, had read extensively about human history and wanted to understand how a species with such a documented record of internal conflict had arrived at the kind of coordinated patience their 60-year strategy required. Seo's answer to that question became one of the things people quoted later when the story was told. She said that human history was full of people doing terrible things to each other, and that this was real and should not be minimized. But she said that running alongside that history always was another thread. People who looked at a bad situation and decided to be the ones who changed it, not through a single dramatic moment, but through sustained, committed, collective patience. She said that humanity had not stopped fighting with itself in the years since contact. They still disagreed constantly, loudly, about almost everything. But they had found enough shared understanding about the situation with the Accord that the disagreements had been channeled into the same direction. She said it was not easy, and it was not perfect, and they had come very close to fracturing more than once. She said that was the honest answer, and she hoped it was useful. Vel Kerath wrote in their personal notes that evening, notes that were eventually archived and made public many years later, that they had found the answer more useful than they had expected, and that it had made them think about some things in their own civilizations, history that they had not considered in a long time. The formal vote on humanity's full membership application was held on a morning in what Earth's calendar called November. The chamber was at capacity. Every gallery seat was filled. The vote required a 2/3 majority of the council. It passed 8-3. The Keth Dominion voted against, along with 2 other members whose opposition was rooted in different combinations of economic anxiety and genuine philosophical disagreement about the pace of change. The record noted their opposition and their stated reasons. The record was public. When the result was announced, there was a sound from the gallery that the official transcripts described as significant nonverbal response from gallery attendees. The transcripts were conservative in their language. What actually happened was that 30-some representatives of species that had sat in those galleries for years, some of them for decades, made sounds of various kinds, some that translated as celebration, some that translated as relief, some that had no direct translation, but that carried the same quality as something long held. Being released. Seojung sat at the table. Not the observer's position, the full table for the first time, with the chair that had been placed at humanity's seat before she entered. She had a small earpiece in her left ear through which her team was transmitting reaction from Earth, where it was very early in the morning, and people had stayed up to watch the session on whatever screen was available to them. She kept her expression steady, because that was what the moment required. But under the table, her hands, folded in her lap, were shaking slightly. She thought about the Draven. She thought about all the species who had pushed and been crushed, or waited and faded. She thought about Ashvel drinking Thun tea in her modest quarters and asking whether the council would agree. She thought about the Pelhari delegate who had made that small, soft sound in the gallery of Part 3 of this journey, the sound that she had heard across the distance and carried with her through 14 months of panels and questions and negotiations. She thought about the people on Earth who had made the decision, 60 years ago and every year since, to be patient, to be thorough, to build something real rather than demand something symbolic. People who would never sit in this chamber. People who had worked in factories and research labs and diplomatic prep sessions in unremarkable buildings. People who had not lived to see this morning. People whose names were not in any official record, but whose work was in every foundation of what stood here now. After the session, Counselor Vrav approached her in the corridor. The old Valhari was not a being who expressed things openly. Her species valued restraint in the same way humans valued directness, but ECO had spent 9 years learning to read her. Vrav said 2 things. She said that the accord was better for having been made to change. And then she said, very quietly, that she wished they had not made it necessary to force the issue. CO considered that for a moment. Then she said she understood the sentiment. But she said that, in her experience, no one ever moves a door until someone pushes it. The question was just whether the ones pushing had the patience to wait until the door was ready to open. Vrav looked at her for a long moment. Then she said something that her staff would not know she had said until much later, when the records were reviewed. She said, the door was always ready. We just needed to stop standing in front of it. Then she walked back to her chambers, and Co Ji-young walked toward hers. And behind them both the gallery was still full of species who were already beginning to ask the questions that come after a door opens, not what was behind it, but what else might be possible, and who else might walk through next. The galaxy had called itself the Eternal Accord for 3,000 years. It still called itself T,